Another mystery buried deep in the hills of eastern Washington keeps resurfacing, a bottomless pit said to be a pathway to the paranormal.
You won't believe what just happened with Mel's Hole. Reports have it that scientists recently evacuated the entire area after dropping a drone down into the pit, sending shockwaves through the community that's been following this mind-bending mystery for years. For those who may be unfamiliar, Mel's Hole is one mystery that has captivated the public's imagination, leaving many convinced that Mel had stumbled upon something truly extraordinary, possibly even extraterrestrial, due to the eerie things that had been happening in and around it. Now that scientists have finally decided to take a closer look inside Mel's Hole, the big question on everyone's mind is, what did they find at the bottom of that seemingly bottomless pit? Has an end to this age-long mystery been met? Let's find out. Something extraordinary and deeply unsettling has just unfolded at the mysterious Mel's Hole. After years of speculation and unanswered questions, scientists have reportedly evacuated the entire area surrounding this bottomless pit, triggered by what they encountered after lowering a drone into its depths. The origins of Mel's Hole date back to 1997, when a Washington man named Mel Waters first brought this bizarre phenomenon to public attention. Appearing on the popular late-night radio show Coast to Coast AM, Mel described a pit on his property with no bottom. Now, over 2 decades later, it appears scientists have finally decided to investigate Mel's Hole more closely, and what they found is unbelievable and more disturbing than anyone ever imagined. Before we go into details of what they saw at the hole, let's rewind to how this story came about in the first place. Years back, a popular late-night radio host named Art Bell received a curious fax from a man named Mel Waters, who had something strange on his property in Manastash, Washington, a hole that seemed to have no bottom. Intrigued, Art invited Mel to his show, Coast to Coast AM, to tell listeners about this strange hole. During the interview, Mel explained that he had purchased the land a few years earlier, but the hole had been there for over 30 years before that, known to the neighbors. They often toss their garbage into it, but the hole never fills. Mel described it as a round pit, about 15 feet deep, with a stone wall lining the sides, but beyond that, it just kept going down into darkness. The most remarkable thing was that no matter what Mel dropped into the hole, a rock, a stick, anything, there was never any sound of it hitting the bottom. And the animals on his property, including his dogs, wanted nothing to do with the mysterious pit. They would refuse to go near it, even if Mel tried to lead them closer. Mel shared a story of how a hunter, whose dog had died and was thrown into the hole, was supposedly seen with the same collar, running through the woods sometime later, without, but strangely didn't recognize the owner. This added to the growing sense of wonder and bewilderment around Mel's Hole. What is the mystery surrounding Mel's Hole? Determined to get to the bottom of it, Mel decided to conduct some experiments. Drawing on his experience as a former shark fisherman, he lowered a candy-tipped fishing line to 2,500 feet. When he pulled the line back up, the candy was still intact, indicating there was no water that deep. This only deepened the mystery surrounding the true nature of the bottomless pit on Mel's property. Mel wasn't done investigating the mysteries of that strange pit on his property. For his next experiment, he decided to lower a heavy 1-pound lead weight into the hole. When Mel finally reached the end of his original spool of fishing line, he tied it to a new spool and kept going. Spool after spool, he lowered line after line until he had used up a total of 80,000 feet, over 15 miles. The listeners tuning into Art Bell's Coast to Coast AM radio show were intrigued by all this, but they also had a lot of skepticism. One thing that stood out was that of the listener who proposed that a live cat be lowered down there, but Art wasn't too keen on that idea. Art suggested that someone be lowered into the pit so they could report back on what was down there. Still, Mel, concerned about the unknown dangers lurking deeper down, refused. Things got more intriguing when he added that the hole had this dizzying effect on people that stood close to it, and radios that had been kept around it automatically tuned to stations that had stopped existing for decades. At this point, the story was getting very wild, but this certainly wasn't the last time Mel Waters and his infamous hole would capture the public's imagination. It was as if a new level of intrigue had been unlocked. People were fascinated about the hole, and before long, people started to propose it is a pathway to another dimension, just like Yamal's sinkhole, otherwise called the doorway to the underworld, because of its purported ability to swallow everything within its vicinity. But were they right? We'll soon find out. The next day, after that interview on Coast to Coast AM, Mel returned to his Manistash property. But when he got there, he was stopped by some uniformed people who told Mel there had been a plane crash, and he couldn't enter his land. Now, Mel didn't believe them, as he saw no smoke or other signs of a crash. But then these people warned him with blackmail that they could easily find a drug lab on his property if he didn't turn around. Mel wasn't going to take that, though. He threatened to take the whole thing to the press. That's when the people made Mel an offer. They said they'd lease his property from him for $3,000 a month, and Mel ended up accepting that deal. Next, Mel had to relocate to Australia, and true to their word, these people paid Mel that huge monthly fee from March 1997 through December 1999. During that time, Mel immersed himself in his lifelong passion, working on wombat rescue and research. But in December of 1999, he had missed his family so much that Mel returned to the US to visit family and make another appearance on Coast to Coast AM. This is the wrong move that would change everything for him, because he was caught and hit by the government with legal papers saying he'd broken building codes on his property. To avoid more trouble, he headed to Olympia, but there was some altercation on the bus, and the police asked Mel to give a statement. He refused, saying he needed to get to Olympia. The next thing he remembered, the officers offered him a ride in their van. 12 days later, Mel woke up in an alley in San Francisco, badly beaten. His teeth were missing, and there were signs he'd been hooked up to an IV. His homemade belt buckle had been stolen, all the money in his account was gone, and his Wombat research facility had been shut down with all his employees laid off. Thankfully, Mel's nephew was there to buy him a bus ticket back home to Washington. And once he'd recovered, Mel took a trip to Ellensburg to see if he could track down someone who might have bought a matching belt buckle from him years ago. And he sure found the person he was looking for. As Mel examined this buckle, he noticed some really strange things about the accompanying coin. For one, it was a Roosevelt dime minted in 1943, and the coin had a mysterious letter B stamped on it. This was strange because there were no Roosevelt-faced dimes issued in 1943, and most surprisingly, no city that's ever minted on US currency has a name starting with B. The buckle's owner was so puzzled that he took the coin to a dealer who was equally baffled but offered a lot of money to buy it. The man decided to think about the offer for a bit, but just a few days later, the Treasury Department showed up and confiscated the coin. Take note of this because later on, you'll get to understand why this happened. Now, a well-known expert named Richard C. Hoagland, who studies hyperdimensional physics, later suggested these coins might have come from a parallel universe. At this point in the Coast to Coast AM broadcast, the audience started to feel a little skeptical about the credibility of Mel's story. It was getting more and more unbelievable as it went on. But then Mel dropped this bombshell. Listen up, because this is one of the wildest moments in radio history. Mel asked Art Bell if he knew about the Terra server, an online database of aerial and satellite imagery launched in December 1997, about 8 months after Mel first appeared on the show. And Mel told the audience that according to his nephew, his old property had somehow been wiped off this Terra server imagery. But before the next commercial break of the program, Art's listeners tracked down the satellite image in question, which made Mel's bizarre more real and believable than before. As if that wasn't enough, a TV crew went to the Ellensburg area and found evidence that the military had been there. And from there, the mystery just kept getting deeper and deeper. Mel had another intriguing piece of information to share. Apparently, he'd been talking to some people at a truck stop near his old property, and they had some wild stories to tell. These truckers claimed they had seen this black beam of what they could only describe as anti-light shooting up into the sky from where that mysterious hole was located. One of Mel's trucker friends even said he had delivered a massive shipment of fiber optic equipment to a warehouse in Ellensburg. Another trucker even said he had transported some large, crated instruments from the Lawrence Livermore National Lab in San Francisco. Mind you, this lab is the one that works for the military. And let's not forget, that's the same city where Mel ended up after his weird abduction incident. So, there seemed to be some connections between this hole and the government. Coast to Coast AM was a massively popular show back then, especially across the western part of the country. And that region has a lot of untouched public land and Native American reservations. So, with the show focusing on all these strange, unexplained mysteries, it naturally attracted a lot of listeners who were just as fascinated by this stuff, and it was only regular for people to want to reach out. One of them was a group of Native Americans in Nevada called the Basque tribe. This encounter forever changed the trajectory of this mysterious tale, while also leaving mystery lovers more perplexed because of the disturbing discovery they had made. What was found inside Mel's hole? In early September 2001, Mel journeyed to Nevada to visit these Native American tribes. It turns out they had done a lot of research into plants and natural medicine and were interested in Mel's work. In fact, Mel told them the plants that seemed to work best were the ones he had grown on the land around that original hole on his property. He described the specific types of plants to them, wondering if they might be familiar with them. 'Twas then they took Mel to an area of their own land where another mysterious hole was located, in the middle of a village where a group of Basque families had settled. The Basques were shepherds. According to them, this hole had been there for as far back as the 1800s. But you know what's most intriguing? The fact that the hole shares some striking key similarities with Mel's original one. The hole was also about 9 feet wide, but instead of a stone wall, it had a metal collar lining the rim that went down as far as you could see, with the area around it warm. Just like Mel's hole, it had some strange sound-canceling properties too, and if you struck the metal rim, it wouldn't make a single sound. The animals in the area seemed just as wary of this hole as they were of Mel's. And to make it more chilling, the villagers had seen that same mysterious black beam of anti-light coming from it, just like some had seen around Mel's property. This was a strange and more fascinating scenario, so Mel and the Basques decided to run some experiments. The first involved lowering a bucket of ice into the pit as far as they could, about 1,500 feet, with another bucket that served as a control kept on the surface. They commenced the experiment, but when they pulled the pit ice back up, it was still frozen, just like it was when lowered down. But this time, something was strange about it. It was warm. This was unbelievable. So determined to get it to melt, they tried cooking the ice over a fire pit. But instead of melting, it caught fire. Fascinated, a certain man took some home to put in his stove. The Basques, still curious to know what was in the hole, wanted to lower one of their own into the hole. But Mel talked them out of it, given what had happened to the ice. Instead, they settled on lowering a sheep down. It was time for the experiment, and the sheep started to scream and caused a ruckus just like other animals did. The fight began to frustrate the Basques, so they ended up knocking the sheep out just enough to stuff it into a crate with a cable attached, ready to be lowered down. As they brought the crate to the hole, the sheep woke up and started letting out these blood-curdling bleats again. But this is where this got more eerie. When the crate got positioned right over the pit, everything just went silent. The sheep was still shaking the box, but not a single sound could be heard over that hole. As Mel and the curious villagers lowered the crate, the sheep's struggles grew more and more faint until they couldn't even tell if it was still moving by the halfway point on the cable. When they reached the entire 1,500 feet, Mel and the others felt this strange vibration in the metal rim of the hole, and after half an hour, they pulled the sheep up only to be shocked to their bones. Tighten your girdle because you too are about to get gobsmacked. From the outside, everything looked normal. But when they opened it up, the sheep was dead and looked cooked from the inside out. In the stomach of the sheep was a strange gel surrounding an enormous tumorous growth inside the sheep's body, and when they cut it open, out came this fleshy creature that looked like a mix of a fetus and a seal, with its eyes looking so much like that of a human. Right before their eyes, it disconnected from the umbilical cord and crawled to the edge of the table, giving Mel the most compassionate look he'd ever seen, which compelled Mel to pick it up and put it on the ground. On the ground, this creature carefully studied each of the humans as if it had some intelligence, and after 2 solid hours, it made its way towards the hole, gave a slow nod, and plunged right back into the pit. Now, this creature in itself and everything surrounding its existence seemed strange, but most bizarre was the fact that shortly after Mel's encounter with it, he got completely healed of a terminal cancer where he had just 6 months to live. When he narrated the incident to one of the Basque elders, the older man didn't even seem surprised, but instead told Mel that he'd always considered this hole a sacred, spiritual place. Before leaving, he closed something in Mel's hand and told him to put it away. It turned out to be a 1943 Roosevelt dime the man had found in the area, which looked just like the one Mel had earlier seen near the hole back in Ellensburg, tuck it into a little red envelope. Months later, Mel Waters made another appearance on the Coast to Coast AM radio show with an intriguing update. Apparently, there had been regular helicopter activity over the village where that second mysterious hole was located. To make this mystery more intriguing, Mel had learned that the metal collar surrounding this particular pit becomes invisible to people once they reach a certain distance away from it. And that strange 1943 dime the Basque elder had given Mel seems to have similar properties. Apparently, it disappears from view entirely when you get about 15 feet away from it, and it can't even be captured on film or by digital scanners. As for that burning ice Mel had told us about before, the guy who had been using a can of it as a heat source in his wood stove all through the colder months started noticing some weird things happening. This Basque fellow said he always felt super thirsty, with the air and his skin getting excessively dry inside his home. He'd try putting a kettle of water on the stove to add some moisture, but he noticed the steam from that seemed to linger around the stove, almost like it was being absorbed. Well, one day, the guy came home to find his whole stove had crashed right through the hearth and floor, sinking about a foot into the ground below. But faced with the freezing temperatures, the cabin owner patched up the stovepipe and just kept using it, with the stove now sitting under his floor, still heating the place. A week or two later, he returns and finds his entire cabin has turned to piles of dry wood dust. So he moves in with his brothers. When he returned a month later, he saw the stove had sunk 5 feet into the ground, leaving a smooth, glassy hole. At that point, he reaches out to Mel, who contacts one of those mysterious officials he had dealt with during his time in Australia. This person seemed troubled and insisted Mel urgently provide the location of that cabin. The Basque guy showed them where it was, then hid nearby and watched what happened next. A team was sent out, and from what the Basque man could tell, it seemed to be a mix of military and scientific personnel. They brought in all kinds of heavy construction equipment, including multiple cranes, but they struggled to lift that stove from the ground. Eventually, they had to drop some chains into the hole and pour water over them before the cranes could finally hoist the whole thing out and load it onto what the Basque guy said was the most enormous truck he'd ever seen. Then they just hauled it all away. Months later, Mel got astonished yet again when the Basques told Mel that the weird creature that came out of the dead sheep had resurfaced multiple times with a message for them, which was made possible through one of their boom boxes. According to them, the creature warned them about the dangers of this burning ice. It told them that if it's misused, the ice has the potential to destroy the entire planet rapidly. In addition, they claimed he also said there are intelligent beings on other worlds who are just waiting for humans to wipe themselves out through nuclear war so they can swoop in and start using this ice on Earth. When you look at all the similarities between these two mysterious holes, Mel's meticulous and consistent narrations, the clear government interest in the property, and the fact that the hole's location has disappeared from maps, it sure seems like someone is trying hard to hide what's happening there. Who knows? Maybe that Gerald R. Osborne was right when he claimed the site was being used as a top-secret government base for alien-related activities. That would line up with the creature's talk of other intelligent beings out there. Think about it. The parallels between these two holes are too numerous to ignore. The metal collars, the strange sound-dampening effects, the animals avoiding them, and the bizarre phenomena surrounding them all point to something extraordinary, possibly even extraterrestrial going on. And then you factor in the heavy-handed government involvement, the attempts to block access, and the efforts to scrub the location from public maps and satellite imagery. That does scream of a massive cover-up. On the other hand, remember the old, no longer existent stations that automatically played when a radio was brought close to it, and the strange old coins that were found around the two holes? Pause for a moment and think, what if there really is a very high possibility that the holes are truly a pathway to another dimension or alternative reality, and the government, knowing about it, decided to use it to their advantage for whatever reason? This whole situation has left us with a lot more questions than answers. What exactly is the government trying to hide? What's the true nature of these mysterious holes and their associated entities? Will the purpose and content of this hole ever be found? We really would love to hear your thoughts on this matter, so please do well to drop them in the comments section. Also, don't forget to support us with your likes and subscription. Thank you.